This is Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. After surviving winter in a frozen state of torpor, it is time to get moving and start breeding. Now, don't call HR on me. I'm not talking about us. I am talking about amphibians. It's amphibian migration season, which means it's time for our annual herpetology show. That's the study of amphibians and reptiles. I'm joined in the studio today by the one and only Jim Andrews. He's a Salisbury herpetologist and the coordinator of the Vermont Amphibian and Reptile Atlas. Jim, it's good to see you again.
Hey, it's great to be here, Michaela.
Yeah, and happy
spring. I really
spring.
enjoy coming in.
And listeners, you can join the conversation as well. Give us a call and tell us about your latest critter sighting. Maybe it was a snapping turtle in the road that you helped to safety, or a strange-looking toad that you need help identifying. You can call in at 800-639-2211 or email us at vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. And Jim, I was just showing you right before the show, we've already had somebody write in and send us some photos that I showed you. Aaron in North Ferrisburg sent in some pictures of some guests that found their way into their sugar house on Monday evening while they were boiling sap. What were they?
Yeah, in the pictures that she sent us, there was a spring peeper, and spring peepers are one of the species that a lot of Vermonters are pretty familiar with, at least the call. I don't know if you've heard the term, Michaela, frog run.
No.
And that's a sugaring phrase for the end of the maple sugar season. The frog run is when you go out to collect the syrup, of course, back when you collected, and you can hear frogs in the distance. And what that means is that the nighttime temperatures are above freezing, which means that the sap will stop running. And so the frog run was probably the last or close to the last time that they would get to get out and collect sap. So, yeah, spring peepers, one of the first to move. Wood frogs are even earlier, a little bit hardier, and they move even a little sooner. And
Can you, before we move on from the peepers, can you do a peeper?
Could I
for
do
us?
a peeper? Beep, 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 beep. And sometimes they're a little tentative. That's not my best my best sounds, but sometimes they're a little tentative, and they parse it out. They break it up. And then when you get a whole bunch of them together, I think I've used this term before on the air with you before, they sound like bells on a horse, like sleigh bells.
Yep.
They sound like somebody shaking sleigh bells. But, this spring we had activity way back. I mean, back March 16th or so, we had a really warm spell. And
I remember it fondly.
Yeah, and people were sending in records at that time. And then it got really cold again. And so those amphibians that were moving at that time, if they'd made it to the ponds, they probably were okay if they could actually get in, if the ponds weren't frozen. And if they didn't, they had to take cover again somewhere. And it got really cold again. And so some of those amphibians didn't survive. We got reports of amphibians that either dehydrated or froze because they had not made it to the ponds and they didn't find a good place to hide.
This is a bit of a grim question, but can you tell by looking at one of these amphibians that has died how it died, if it froze or dehydrated?
Well, if it's severely dehydrated, we can see that because they actually shrivel. They lose body mass. That would take some time for that to happen. Yeah. But no, I think the general answer is if they're freshly dead, we don't know what killed them. And of course, we're concerned about the potential of diseases. I mean, there's a disease now, salamander chytrid in Europe, that we're just real concerned about, in that we're hoping it doesn't make it to the United States. If it did, it might come through the pet trade. Somebody having a species that comes from a foreign country and buying it and keeping it, and somehow that disease getting out. But so disease is a concern, and when we see dead amphibians in the spring, we often collect them and send them off to labs to see if it was a disease issue. But I think this year we have had a number of reports of winter kill, And I think that was, in this case, because we had a real winter.
Yeah.
And we actually had snow, and we had cold weather.
I was looking back at our show last year that we did, and I was talking all about how it was such a mild winter and asking you about what the effects on the amphibian species were. And now I want to know, now that we had this legitimate Vermont winter, how are they doing?
Well, I think most of the amphibians are doing fine, but it's interesting, and one picture that I might be able to paint for people that would help them understand the situation is that the few amphibians that we have that overwinter in water, most don't. Mm-hmm. Most are on land. But let's say the newts, the adult newts, might be in your ponds.
So the pond's frozen solid, and those newts are under
and
there,
they're
just
underneath
hanging
it.
out.
And what's
amazing.
Interesting is we've had reports in the winter from skaters and cross-country skiers, and what they see is an area of the pond where there's a spring. And so the ice didn't freeze there. There was no ice. And there are masses of newts in there. Like most of the newts from the whole pond are in that same area. So you can literally see thousands in this one opening. But if that opening freezes over, then they lose access to that slightly warmer water, groundwater, which also has oxygen in it. And that's what they're fighting for. Mm. They're fighting for oxygen.
It's not just about the warmth; it's the oxygen they're getting.
I mean, it's the warmth. It's the warmth that's keeping it from freezing.
Yep.
But it's the oxygen under the ice that's really a limiting factor. Mm. Of course, if it froze to the bottom, if their pond froze to the bottom, they're in trouble too. But there's organic material underneath the ice that's trying to decompose that uses up the oxygen. And so they essentially run out of oxygen. So we have had that happen this year, but that's happened before. I mean, it's an awful thing, and it's sad, but that's happened before in other years, and they will survive that.
How exactly does a species like a newt survive in water that is that cold?
Well, first of all, unlike us, I mean, we have to continue to eat a lot of food for fuel to keep our body temperatures up, and through the night and through the day. We're keeping it at 98.6.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
It's like feeding wood to your wood stove. You got to keep it going in. But on the other hand, if you kept your house at 45 degrees, then you would not have to use nearly as much wood. So when the amphibians cool down in the winter, they don't need food, mm-hmm. and they don't need as much oxygen because their whole metabolic rate has slowed down tremendously. A thing like a wood frog, a creature like a wood frog would not have had anything to eat for 7 months. Oof. And then they thaw out and they warm up and they're hungry again. Oh, but they got to mate first.
Sure.
Mate first.
Mate before you eat.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, and then you can
good
go.
Rule.
And then you can go eat. Because they are cooled down so much, they need less food and they need less oxygen. And the oxygen they're getting because they can't come to the surface.
Yeah.
They're getting through their skin from the water. This is oxygen dissolved in the water, which is an amazing thing. I mean, just imagine if we could do that.
Solve all my problems.
Yeah. If you could bring in oxygen through your skin. Well, toads, as a matter of fact.
What?
Sue Morse, who's a wildlife photographer, ecologist. I don't know if you know her. She just gave me a call night before, to tell me that she had seen her first toad of the year.
Uh-huh.
She said she kissed it. She was in her driveway and she kissed a toad for the first time this year.
She serious or kidding?
Yeah, she's serious.
Okay.
Toads have a capillary bed. So if you picked up a toad and looked between their hind legs, you would see a reddish pink patch. That's where there's a dense group of capillaries.
That's where their blood is?
So that brings their blood very close to the skin. And so if they're thirsty, they could sit in a mud puddle and take in all the water they need directly through their butt and up into their blood. And because amphibians don't drink, I mean, they're bringing in the moisture that they need through their skin. They can also lose moisture through their skin, which is an issue, so they could dry out, and that's why they shouldn't be moving around on a sunny day when it's dry. But to think of them being able to just go sit in a wet spot,
it's amazing.
I mean, imagine humans doing that sort of thing. You're walking through town, and you see your friend sitting in a mud puddle. I'm a little thirsty,
That sounds like the makings of a great children's book.
It could be.
Which is my very smooth segue to our first caller, who I believe,
Sure,
as you were telling me before the show started, has written a children's book.
Yeah.
Carrie in Malden, Mass. is calling in. Carrie, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks so much for taking my call.
Sure.
Yes. Jim, I'm so excited to hear your broadcast today. I love to hear all these awesome details about amphibian life. And I wrote a book called Safe Crossing, which is about volunteers, a family of volunteers who work with their local amphibian conservation group to help amphibians across the street. And it was partly inspired by the Moncton Wildlife Tunnels.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we really appreciate you writing the book and getting that out there. And I hope lots of people get an opportunity to read that. I understand you are actually giving a presentation pretty soon?
Yes, this Saturday at Shelburne, Vermont, at the Pearson Library at 10:30 a.m. Everyone's invited. It's a free event open to the public. So you're invited, and anyone else interested in amphibians. I'd love everyone to come see our reading. Chris CSLI is coming to share the behind-the-scenes true life story about the Moncton Tunnel.
Oh, well, thanks.
So it should be fun.
Thank you. So that book is called
great.
Safe Crossing. The event's Saturday, April 5th at the Pearson Library in Shelburne. The caller just brought up the Moncton Wildlife Tunnels. Can you tell us a little bit about those? They're in your neck of the woods.
Sure. She mentioned one person who was going to be at that presentation with her giving some information, and that's Chris Slasar. Chris Slasar is an important ally of ours, conservation ally at VTrans, the Agency of Transportation. And the town of Moncton was fortunate to have Chris Slasar on the Conservation Commission, local, and Steve Perrin, who was a retired Vermont Fish and Wildlife non-game biologists, both on the local conservation commission, so that when we at the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas pointed out that there was a major crossing in their town, they both started gathering information data on the area where these amphibians were crossing, and sadly all the mortality, all the amphibians that were getting killed by cars, because it's a fairly busy road. This is the Moncton Virgins Road. It's kind of a shortcut between Route 7 and Taft Four Corners, if you're going that way. And so it's pretty busy. And so they managed, with help from the Lewis Creek Association and us and fundraisers, an Indiegogo campaign, grants brought in through Fish and Wildlife and the Federal Highway Administration, to build a very successful underpass that's not only used by amphibians, but also used by a wide variety of mammals. And this year we got our first photos, because we have cameras in the tunnels, our first photos of a bear actually going through the tunnel, which is a little small for him, but or her. But a graduate student, Matt, recently finished, Marcelina, recently finished his graduate thesis in studying how effective the barrier walls were at that site, and they were just something like 93%. They reduced the number of amphibians on the road by something like 93%, as I recall. So they've been very effective, and they've been copied in other states and in other places. So it's cool. But like I say, it's not just when you build these things, it not only helps with amphibians and reptiles, but it helps with, well, heck, there were wood ducks even walking through these tunnels.
Wow.
I don't know if you know about wood ducks.
Not a lot.
But they nest in trees, wood ducks,
Makes sense.
They nest in holes in trees, And these holstered trees may be some distance away from the wetland where they want to take their kids. And so when the kids are old enough, they drop out of the trees. You may have seen, there's videos online where the babies are...
They just drop.
Drop right, they drop, hit the ground, and the mama walks them from there to the wetland. And so we have video of mama walking her kids under the road instead of over the road to get to the wetland. It's just one example.
Multi-use.
Yeah, of a variety of creatures that are actually using these underpasses. So other parts of the world, other parts of the country, doing really larger scale where they're trying to do underpasses or overpasses for like bighorn sheep, grizzly bears, other things, particularly out west.
Yeah.
But we're very proud of that tunnel. It's been very effective. I got a kick out of it because I was looking recently on Google Earth, which I use a lot, and they labeled them Moncton Amphibian Underpass. If you look on Google Earth, they label it as a tourist attraction.
Oh. You got to start charging admission.
Yeah,
or something,
you can go
Jim.
crawl through those tunnels yourself.
Jim, let's pause here for a
Sure.
moment. We're talking reptiles and amphibians today with herpetologist Jim Andrews. And if you have a question about how to help frogs or turtles or salamanders survive and thrive in our region, or maybe you are concerned about how you're taking care of your backyard and how to support the species that might be living there, call in at 800-639-2211. We'll take some of those calls when we come back. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Today is our annual herpetology show with Jim Andrews, the coordinator of the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, aka the Herp Atlas. Herpetology is the study of amphibians and reptiles, many of which are on the move right now during their spring migration and breeding season. All right, Jim, we have a caller in St. George, Jane, on the line with a question for you. Jane, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Jim. I have a question. This is not pertaining to this year's sightings, but the past few years I've noticed quite a few red Fs on our land with tumor-like growths on their body. Mm-hmm. Some are fairly large for their small size, and I'm just wondering if these are parasites or some other disease, and does this affect their metamorphosis into adult red-spotted newts, ultimately? If you know anything about this, it's been disturbing.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that you could be seeing, Jane. One that I've personally seen a number of times is a fungal infection. And I sent it off to a wildlife lab in Washington, D.C., and they told me it was an ichthyophonus-like fungus. So not unlike what fish can get, and it's called fish ick. So that may have been what you were looking at. There are other smaller growths that could show up on a newt, eastern newt. So without actually sending a specimen off to a wildlife lab, we wouldn't know for sure what you were looking at. But I have seen fungus-like infections on some of the newts, particularly when they were coming out of beaver ponds, and beaver ponds that had leeches and that may have been helping to spread that disease.
Well, thank you, Jane, for calling in. It's tough to hear about those diseases that are spreading. We did a show recently, Jim, about bats in our region, which have also, struggled mightily with a fungal disease.
White
it's hard to hear
syndrome.
about other ones coming through the region.
There are a number of diseases out there, and like you might imagine, we don't know a great deal about all of them. We know a fair amount about a few of those diseases that have been studied fairly heavily. And recently, Vermont Fish and Wildlife has developed a contract with a wildlife health lab. And so they can, if people have a major die-off or they're seeing a problem that has affected a large number of amphibians, they can get in touch with, I would get in touch with Luke Groff or Mark Ferguson at Fish and Wildlife, and they may be able to send some animals off. But like I said before, this spring, there's a fair amount of mortality as a result of just plain winter kill. Yeah.
Well, let's go next to Dennis in Brandon. Dennis,
Okay.
you're on the air. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call, Michaela.
Yeah.
Ever since I was a kid, when I saw a big snapping turtle under the ice in the winter,
Yep.
I've always wondered if there's a pond with a bunch of turtles in it, how do they breathe? I'm sure I know that you said that their metabolic rate goes down.
Yeah.
And I know there's some air bubbles under the ice.
Mm-hmm.
But how do you have all these reptiles breathing air under the ice in a pond all winter long?
Yes, I concur, Dennis. How in the world does that work?
Well, first of all, most reptiles, as you know, are on land and they're not underwater. But the snapping turtles are indeed under the ice. Wood turtles under the ice, painted turtles, and some of the other turtles. Most of the other turtles under ice. But first of all, is the whole idea of lowering your metabolic rate until it's just above freezing. Second of all is having access to the water and the dissolved oxygen in the water. So we're kind of brought up to believe that these dudes are burrowing down into the mud, but that's not a good place for them to be. If they really were down deep in the mud, there's less dissolved oxygen available for them to get either through the lining of their mouth, pharyngeal breathing, and like I mentioned, Michaela, with the toad, you could see a red patch on the butt of the toad. You can see in the mouth of a turtle in the winter all the capillaries in their mouth that are taking oxygen directly out of the water. There's also places in their armpits, etc., where the skin is thin and they can take oxygen from the water through the skin. Still, though, if the amount of dissolved oxygen under the ice gets too low, you could still see mortality. But it's that combination of having a really, really cooled down metabolic rate. You're not developing eggs, you're not healing, you're not digesting food. You are just making it through the winter.
Do you think they're thinking under there?
Thinking?
Yeah. Are they like, "Whoo, it's cold"?
Personally, no, I don't. But they do respond. So sometimes people, like skaters who are skating on really clear ice, will scare a turtle that was on the bottom underneath the ice, and it'll move. It'll swim and try to hide again. Back in the day, we had some. Well, for one research project that we did on spiny soft-shell turtles.
Oh, those are my favorites.
And
they look so weird.
Yeah, they're funny looking with a kind of a long, thin snout.
Yeah, they're mushy
and
back.
a pig-like nose.
Yeah.
But we wanted to change the transmitters. We had radio transmitters on the turtles, and we wanted to change the transmitters on the turtles, but the turtles got wise to the researchers, and as you approached them, once they had been handled, they would get the heck out of there. And so we thought, well, maybe we could get to them in the winter. So we hired these people to dive in the winter in Lake Champlain, and they had transmitters on them, so we knew where the turtles were, and they would go down to the bottom and find the turtles, and the turtles had most of their bodies were actually down under the mud, but their face, their head, and nostrils were up and in the water. And so
it's like being tucked under a blanket.
Yeah, well, yeah, but the blanket didn't keep them very warm.
Oh.
It just kept them out of sight.
All right.
And then they were taking in oxygen into the capillaries in their mouth. And I think it's to their advantage, at least those guys, to be in a place where there's some water movement.
Yeah.
To bring them. And actually, one thing that was interesting about those spiny softshells, one of many things, was that most of the Canadian turtles in the Canadian part of Lake Champlain were coming down to this one area in Vermont. And by coming down, I mean like like 40 kilometers, a long
Wow.
swim, to this one area in Vermont, which was between the ends of the causeways where the bridge is now between Swanton and Alberg.
Yeah.
They were coming down into that area to spend the winter. But I'm digressing a lot, but the point being, metabolic metabolism really slow, don't need much oxygen, and get yourself in a place where you can get enough dissolved oxygen out of the water, either through the lining of your mouth or through sections of your skin. I mean, in some parts of the world, there are turtles that have cloacal bursae. You'll like this.
Okay. I know where you're going with this.
This is what we call butt breathing. This bursae is a sac.
Okay.
And so there's these sacs openings near the cloaca, which
I
is
know about
where
those.
the
Yep.
waste comes out. And oxygen can go in there, and they're lined with capillaries, and so they can get oxygen from the water there too. But
It's pretty amazing. I mean,
yeah,
as
all the
silly as this can
adaptations,
sound,
sure.
like absolutely incredible. And Dennis, thanks for calling in and bringing up turtles and snapping turtles
Sure.
in particular. I live in an area that is close to a wetland, and there's a big fast road, and they're always in the summer we see snapping turtles there all the time, and it's really panic inducing that I'm about to see one get
Sure.
cracked right open. If somebody sees a snapping turtle on the road, are there best practices for moving it yourself, or should you call your cell phone or somebody else?
We actually have a video on our YouTube station.
Okay.
We don't have a lot of activity on our YouTube station, but we do have videos
All right.
there, and one of them is of me showing people how to safely handle snapping turtles.
Okay.
And the trick with snapping turtles is that they can bite, and
I've heard, yeah.
yeah, and you do have to be careful that you don't get bit, and they could. They could easily get through your flesh and do some damage to your fingers. So the other thing to remember is that their reach, the length of their neck, is about the length of their shell. So
Wow, that's long.
yeah, so if you see like a 12-inch shell, then you best keep your hands at least 12 inches from the head and neck area.
Okay.
Now, they can't, though, reach back. If you were to grab them by their hind legs,
Yep.
which I do, and the base of the hind legs is really strong. And so I get around behind them, and I pick them up by the base of their hind legs. And you can pick them up and hold them out away from you, facing away from you.
Okay.
So their head is not facing your
yeah.
body.
Yep.
And you could carry them that way. You could also, if you can imagine where the hind legs come out of the shell, there's an opening there which some people refer to as the wheel wells,
Okay.
and you can actually grab from the back of the shell and get your hands in there in the wheel wells on both sides if it's not a huge turtle, and you can lift it up and carry it off. But your hands have got to be way back toward the rear end of the turtle. Now, what you're talking about, Michaela, we're not going to see until May through about mid-June. Those turtles... Well, we have had, my daughter reported some basking painted turtles already, and I know that we've gotten some photos of wood turtles basking, but most turtles won't be active or won't be very active until things warm up a little bit more. But it's in May and through like the first half of June when the females are looking for a place to lay their eggs, and so they have to come on land. And they're looking for an open, sunny, either mowed or just plain open for other reasons area where they can lay their eggs and they'll be incubated by the heat of the sun. And unfortunately for them, road margins are mowed and open and sunny. And so road margins, driveways, gardens, some
Yeah.
people's lawns are places where turtles will try to lay their eggs. And I generally do, if I can, safely pull over and carefully check for traffic. And then I generally do try to help the turtles get across the road in the direction that they want to go. Mm-hmm. If you put them back in the pond,
they're just going to go right back.
They're just going to turn around and come back when they get a chance. Yeah. Painted turtles, not an issue. Even if they bit you, it might be a pinch, but it's not really going to break your skin. But with snapping turtles, you do have to be really careful that you don't get your hands close enough to their neck and head.
Well, I see 10 fingers on you right in front of me, so it seems like you're doing okay.
Yeah. Okay. Though I did have a student, a UVM student of mine, that had a scar on her knee from picking up a snapping turtle and head down. She was holding it head down.
Oh, and it reached to her knee and bit her.
In a bit her knee. Yeah. That was not using my recommended technique.
She hadn't watched the YouTube video.
Yeah, no, she was that had happened before she got to my herpetology class.
Let me ask you a question. We just got via email from Michael in Windsor. Michael says that they enjoy listening for amphibian calls in spring and summer, but has not yet heard of Fowler's toad in the fields of Vermont. Can you suggest a location and time of year where they might hear a Fowler's toad? What is a Fowler's toad?
First of all, most people would not even be aware that we have two different kinds of toads. But we do have, in Vermont, Fowler's toad that is very rare in this state, and we're at the northern extreme of its range. And the only place that we know of where these toads breed is the southern Connecticut River Valley, very close to the Massachusetts border. So very limited distribution. And they call late, June or July, after it's warmed up quite a bit.
What do they sound like? What's
American toads. American toads have a
Don't ignore me, Jim. I'll ask again.
have a really melodious call that lasts for 10 or 15 seconds and sounds like a combination of a hum and a whistle at the same time. It's really pretty and musical. Whereas the call of a Fowler's toad sounds more like somebody strangling your neighbor's sheep. It's wah, 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 wah. It's not a pretty song. It doesn't last very long. That wasn't my best rendition.
It was perfect.
So you'd have to travel to the southern Connecticut River Valley late in the year on a warm night, and even still, it's a very rare species. That, by the way, it's a rare species that likes disturbed soil. So there's a benefit to rivers being able to flood and deposit gravel or sand along the margins of a river, because that's the kind of soil they like.
Oh, we've sure seen a lot of that recently.
Yeah, we've seen some more of that.
At least the Fowler's toads are happy with the flooding. If you have questions about an amphibian or reptile that you have seen recently, give us a call at 800-639-2211. You can describe it to us, and I bet our guest, Jim Andrews, will have an interesting fact about it to share. We're going to pause for one more quick break, Jim. When we come back, we'll take some more of those calls. This is Vermont Edition. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Michaela Lefrak. Today is our annual herpetology show with Jim Andrews, the coordinator of the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. And before we dive back in, I just want to remind you that this delightful conversation that we're having and all of our work here on Vermont Edition is supported by you. We're in the midst of Vermont Public's spring membership drive, and we are asking you to support our journalistic work with a donation right now at vermontpublic.org or on the Vermont Public app. And when you donate, you will help keep programs like Vermont Edition on the air here at Vermont Public. So you can learn more on our website, vermontpublic.org. And thank you in advance for your support. Jim, let's talk big nights.
Yep, I'm glad you brought that up.
For folks who don't know what that is, I know we have a lot of fans of big nights listening, but for people who haven't heard of them, what are they?
Well, a big night is a night in the spring where conditions are right, which means that temperatures above freezing, and actually the warmer it is, the better. I mean, if it's 40 or 50 degrees, it's even better. Where it's rained during the day, roads are wet, and amphibians are migrating. So that folks get a chance to get out and see large migrations of different species of amphibians. Now, there have been some migrations that have already taken place so far this year. I would not call any of them big nights. We had a couple little nights and a couple medium nights, but maybe this Saturday, looking at the weather forecast. Okay. Now, let me throw in this one other thing. So after people go out for the demonstrations during the afternoon, then
there's some protests for this weekend.
Then, if it continues to rain and we have wet evenings, to go out with a flashlight on a nice, quiet back road where it's safe, and that comes between an overwintering site for the amphibians where they get down deep in the soil and overwinter, and a breeding site. And amphibians will be coming out of their overwintering sites, moving down the hill across the road and trying to get to their breeding habitat. And so these have become, getting out on these nights has become a pretty popular rite of spring in much of the Northeast anyhow. And I should mention that there's a variety of organizations in Vermont that organize events.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how people can find out about them in their region.
You know, down in the southern part of the state, there's the Bonnievale Environmental Education organization, BEAC. Patty Smith down there organizes people to get out in different spots.
We just had her on to talk about beavers recently.
Oh, so. Good. North Branch Nature Center outside of Montpelier organizes people to get out and identify crossing areas, and you can help them out. The Vermont Center for Eco Studies organizes people to get out and check on vernal pools where amphibians are breeding. There's local efforts, like this year for the first time, Shelburne is going to close Pond Road on a night when amphibians are migrating, so people can get out and experience amphibian migration without having any traffic. We also do that in Salisbury, the Salisbury Conservation Commission and Otter Creek Audubon Society. We have 2 nights, public nights in the spring, where we invite people out to join us and we gather data. But these are just some of the organizations that get out and organize these events. I mean, you could just find a good crossing area near your home. And again, a small road that comes between a wooded, hilly site where amphibians could have spent the winter in a wetland. And walk that road at night with something bright and reflective on so you don't get hit, with flashlights after dark and when the road's wet on a warm night. And like I said, this Saturday, so far, the forecast looks good for rain this Saturday.
Jim, you just mentioned that not only do you get to observe these critters on a big night and help them cross the road safely, but there's also a data collection component.
Well, some of these organizations are collecting data. North Branch Nature Center is collecting data on where the crossings are and trying to identify the important amphibian crossing areas across roads. Vermont Center for Eco Studies is trying to identify the vernal pools and what species are using individual vernal pools. The new crossing that will be held on Pond Road in Shelburne, they will be collecting data so we get an idea of how many of each species are actually crossing. And there'll be people there to help you identify the species and to help you figure out, what to do and how to safely handle the amphibians, all that kind of stuff. And we do that, too, in Salisbury on our Morgan Road crossing. And we have an email list, and people can get in touch with us, and we put them on that email list, and we let them know when it looks like there will be good conditions, and then we get back in touch that evening to confirm. I mean, we thought there was going to be reasonable conditions this last Monday night, but we didn't get the rain that was forecast, and so we ended up canceling that public night. Some people still went out, and actually it was wet enough, so there was still some activity. Not what we would call a big night.
Medium night.
Okay. And so this is the time of year to get out and participate in those events. And like I say, there's lots of them scattered around the state.
Jim, we just got a correction.
Okay.
From our buddy Glenn, who was listening when we were talking earlier about Canadian turtles swimming in Lake Champlain, to parts of the lake that are in Vermont. I believe we said that they come down to the Vermont side, but Glenn points out that Lake Champlain flows north from the Poultney River, so these turtles are in fact swimming upstream to get to Vermont.
That's true. By down, I've meant south.
South, yes.
Okay.
But thank you, Glenn, for noting
Thanks,
that they are technically swimming upstream.
Okay.
Appreciate
Yes.
that.
Sure.
Yeah, we want to remain as harmonious as we can with our Canadian neighbors right now. So last year, Jim, I was looking back at what we talked about, and you had mentioned on our herpetology show that there were a couple species that haven't been seen in a long time in our region that you're hoping, maybe when people are out doing data collection that they or out walking in the woods that they can help track. And one of them was the North American racer snake. You'd said that it hadn't been seen in about a decade in this region. And I hear that there's an update to that. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. And we did get some press coverage out of that too. We Luke Groff, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and the Vermont Reptile Amphibian Atlas organized a survey effort in an area where racers had last been seen. Racers are a cool snake. I mean,
What do
we're
they
talking
look like?
5 or 6 feet long and solid black and smooth. They are not,
6
Michaela,
feet long.
Just reading from your reaction, we might want to start you with a smaller snake.
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm scared of snakes, but that's a big snake.
It is a big snake. And most of us in Vermont, when we think of snakes, we think of something
garter
about,
snakes.
Garter snakes,
Yeah.
about 2 feet long. Yeah. But we have a couple of these species that are really pretty big and can get over 6 feet long. And this is one of them. And this one is a particularly active snake. So...
Is it fast? Is that why it's called a racer snake?
Yeah, 2014 was the last year that we'd actually gotten a report of the species in the state. And so we organized a group, and Luke got some folks to come up from Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We got some folks from the Herp Atlas, and we spent a day in open habitat. In this particular case, it's a power line, because these snakes like that kind of early successional habitat where they get lots of sun. And we did find one, and we're going to do that again this year and see if we can find a couple more snakes. And so
what do you mean a power line?
Well, by power line, I mean if you look at the electrical corridors that we have in Vermont, they need to be kept open by the power companies.
It's not up it. The snake. It was just hanging out in the grass below.
Yeah.
Okay.
Those corridors need to be kept open so that the trees and shrubs, don't grow up into the lines. And so they actually, although they're not particularly attractive, those power corridors, they provide early successional habitat, like old field habitat, where snakes can get a fair amount of sun. There are a number of other benefits too, like bear and deer and turkey all like to feed in those areas, but we often look for snakes along those kind of sunny power line corridors. And so we were searching one of them and did find a racer, so that was very, very exciting, though I don't think we have very many of these particular creatures. They require a lot of that open habitat. They may travel a number of miles in a couple of weeks. And to be able to do that, to travel a couple of miles in early successional habitat without crossing a road or without running into farming equipment or some other threat is difficult. I suspect that back in the day when we were once mostly agricultural and mostly open habitat about 100 years ago, that they actually were better off back then. And as we lose that open, grassy habitat, they have fewer places to really travel and feed. So that was very exciting, that find. There's another species that people probably haven't heard about that entirely disappeared from Vermont. Last person to see one was Mark Ferguson from Vermont Fish and Wildlife back in 1999. And that's a boreal chorus frog, which is essentially something that it's a frog closely related to a peeper, spring peeper, but their call is different. It's very metallic sounding, maybe slightly electronic sounding, and it's parsed into little pieces. And the only places that we knew about this particular frog were the northwest corner of the state. And I bring it up because northern species that barely make it into Vermont would be those that were most at threat from a warming climate. They might be pushed out.
Right.
They might be pushed further north. Now, we don't know in this case that it was climate change that had an impact on that particular species. There could have been other things, but it's frustrating that we don't know exactly why it disappeared, but it hasn't been seen now since 1999. But, Michaela, I also, there's another creature out there that looks a lot like a garter snake, very, very similar, and your first reaction might be that looks like a skinny, high-fashion garter snake, nicely marked.
So wearing like a top hat or something?
Yeah, it's really nicely dressed. Because it has a beautiful mahogany color on the edge of the belly, and brightly marked, high contrast, with a bright white chin, and that's really what you got to see. It has.
What's it called?
It's called the eastern ribbon snake.
Eastern ribbon.
Looks a lot like a garter snake. Okay. We would love to get more people reporting this. We have one couple down in Benson who have already reported them this year. Despite being a fairly southern species, they come out fairly early in the spring. And they're always near wetlands because they feed on amphibians. So they're always near wetlands. They look like a skinny garter snake with actually not a green head, but a reddish head. And if you, it's kind of a sandwich pattern where the red is the top piece of bread. The black is the bologna in the middle. So red, black, and white on the bottom. And it really, if you see it close up, you see that bright white lip. And it doesn't really matter if you know for sure what you're looking at. I mean, we get records all the time at the Atlas of people who took photos and sent them to us, and we can figure out what they are. If they can get a good photo of the species, particularly of the head, we can figure it out. But we would love to have more people aware of and looking for that species. Just last year, we got the first report of that species in Grand Isle since 1940 or something like that. Yeah, so people are really helpful if they get out there and send us pictures of what they've seen.
And we'll link to the Herp Atlas
Sure.
In the show notes for this show. I also mentioned a number of the shows we did recently as part of our Animal Hour series last month. You can find those in the Vermont Edition podcast feed. One last email from Linda in Brattleboro who writes, "We have a small pond nearby and I love hearing our frog chorus. One thing that surprises me is how the chorus immediately stops when they or one of the frogs realizes I am near.
Yeah.
Total silence from all." Well, Jim Andrews, thanks so much for helping us celebrate all the wonders of the reptiles and amphibians in our region.
You're welcome. It's great to be here, Michaela.
All right, that is all the time that we have for today. If you enjoyed the conversation you just heard and the fact that anyone could listen to Vermont Edition for free, consider making a gift to Vermont Public during our spring membership campaign. You can do that on the Vermont Public app or vermontpublic.org. Our show today was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our producers are John Ahrens, Andrea Lorian, Daniela Fierro, and our intern, Anna Berg. Our theme music is by Myra Flynn. I'm Michaela Lafrac. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch up again soon.